That day, the atmosphere at one of the most prestigious universities abroad was unusually calm. Inside a spacious lecture hall, students from diverse backgrounds sat in neat rows, their books and laptops open in front of them. At the front of the class stood Professor Eleanor Hart, a 56-year-old lecturer with a dignified presence. Her hair had begun to turn gray, and she wore a neatly pressed black suit, exuding an air of authority. Professor Eleanor was widely known as a highly intelligent and critical academic, outspoken in her atheist views. For her, religion was nothing more than a social construct that restricted rational thought. She often encouraged her students to think logically and critically challenge their beliefs. Among the students sat an 18-year-old young woman named Asia Malik. Her face was soft, yet her sharp eyes radiated a quiet confidence. Unlike most of her classmates, she wore an elegant dark blue hijab. Asia was no ordinary student. She was a hafiza, someone who had memorized the entire Qur'an, and she came from a well-educated Muslim family. That morning, the philosophy and science class began as usual. Professor Eleanor picked up a marker and wrote a bold question on the board. "Does God really exist?" Immediately, whispers spread throughout the classroom. Some students looked intrigued, while others appeared uneasy. Professor Eleanor gave a thin smile as she observed their reactions. "Today, we will discuss a fundamental question that has been debated for centuries," she said in a calm yet piercing tone. "Is God real? Or is he merely a product of human imagination?" She paused for a moment before continuing. "Many of you may believe in God. But do you truly have a logical reason for it? Or do you simply believe because of your upbringing and traditions?" Some students nodded in agreement, while others looked uncertain. Professor Eleanor took a few steps toward the center of the classroom. "I want someone to be brave enough to stand up and explain to me, using scientific reasoning, why they believe in God." A heavy silence fell over the room. Not a single student dared to speak. They all knew how sharp and relentless the professor's arguments could be. But in the middle row, Asia calmly raised her hand. Professor Eleanor looked slightly surprised. Then, with a sarcastic smile, she said, "We have someone willing to step forward. Please introduce yourself." Asia stood up, her gaze steady and unwavering. "My name is Asia Malik," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "And I believe in God, not just because of faith, but because of science and logic." The classroom fell completely silent. All eyes turned toward Asia. Professor Eleanor crossed her arms over her chest, studying the young woman before her. "All right, Asia," she said. "Give me one scientific reason that proves God exists." Her eyes gleamed with challenge. Asia took a deep breath, allowing herself a small smile as she prepared to answer. She understood that this was no ordinary discussion. This was a moment where her belief would be tested in front of an audience shaped by rationality and skepticism. The students held their breath, waiting for her response. Some remained motionless, while others secretly hoped Asia would offer a truly compelling argument. Professor Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Well, Asia," she said, her tone laced with doubt. "Give me just one scientific reason that proves God exists. And remember, I expect something logical. Or did you already anticipate this question?" Asia, maintaining her composure, began to speak. "Professor, before I answer your question, may I ask you something?" she said. Professor Eleanor narrowed her eyes, considering the request before nodding. "Do you believe that something complex and orderly requires a designer?" Asa asked. The professor paused for a moment before responding. "Of course. The laws of physics and science show that anything complex typically has a scientifically explainable origin." Asa nodded. "Good. So if we come across a watch with an intricate and perfectly synchronized mechanism, we must conclude that there is a maker, right?" "Yes, of course," Professor Eleanor answered. Asa nodded briefly, then continued, her voice growing steadier. If that's the case, what about the universe? It is far more complex and orderly than a simple watch. Is it really possible that something so extraordinary just appeared on its own, without anyone creating it? Once again, the class fell into silence. Some students exchanged glances, while others, who had initially shown little interest in the discussion, began to pay close attention. Professor Eleanor chuckled. "Asia, I'll admit your argument is interesting. But it's too simplistic. Science has already proven that the universe came into existence because of the Big Bang, not because of a creator." Asia smiled. "All right, Professor, I'll follow your line of reasoning. Since we are discussing the Big Bang, I have a question. What triggered the Big Bang?" Professor Eleanor sighed before responding. "According to science, the Big Bang originated from an extremely small and dense singularity, which then exploded and expanded, forming the universe as we know it today." Asia nodded slowly. "So, Professor, do you believe that something can come from nothing?" Professor Eleanor hesitated for a brief moment. She knew this was not an easy question to answer scientifically. The law of conservation of energy states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, it can only change form. So, where did the initial energy that triggered the Big Bang come from? A quiet murmur spread through the class as students whispered among themselves, discussing Asia's question. Suddenly, a male student sitting in the back raised his hand. "Professor, isn't Asia's question reasonable? If everything needs a cause, then shouldn't there be something that caused the universe to exist in the first place?" Professor Eleanor's expression turned blank for a moment, as she tried to regain control of the discussion. "That question is often raised in philosophy," she replied. "But science does not need the hypothesis of God to explain the universe." Asia offered a gentle smile. "Professor, I understand that science attempts to explain everything without invoking God. But doesn't that also mean science has its limitations? If we are unable to explain something, does that mean it simply doesn't exist?" The professor fell silent. She was not someone who could be easily defeated in a debate, but she could feel that Asia was no ordinary student. The girl spoke with unshakable confidence. Still, Professor Eleanor was not ready to concede. She crossed her arms and said, "All right, Asia. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the universe does have a designer. But how can you be sure that this designer is the God you believe in? Why couldn't it just be the laws of nature working by themselves?" Asia took a deep breath before answering. "Professor, the laws of nature are part of the order I just spoke about. The law of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, even the DNA in our bodies, all of them follow structured and precise patterns. The laws of nature cannot create themselves. There must be something that established these laws in the first place. And in Islam, we call that being Allah, the creator who was never created." From the corner of the classroom, a female student raised her hand. "Asia, I want to know one thing," a student said hesitantly. "If God really exists, then why is there so much suffering in this world? Why are there wars, natural disasters, and diseases?" Asia turned to the student with a gentle smile. "That is a very good question," she said. "Many people ask the same thing. But let me ask you something in return. Can we truly understand happiness without ever experiencing sadness?" The student fell silent, thinking about the question. Asia continued, "In Islam, this world is a test. Every hardship, every challenge has wisdom behind it. We may not always be able to see it immediately, but that does not mean there isn't a greater reason behind it. Think of a small child who does not understand why his parents forbid him from playing with fire. The parents know better than the child. Similarly, we cannot always comprehend the wisdom behind what happens in our lives, but God does." The classroom grew quiet. Many students who had previously been skeptical now seemed deep in thought. Professor Eleanor took a deep breath. She was still searching for a way to dismantle Asia's argument, but the girl remained calm and composed. However, the professor was not one to give up easily. She looked at Asia with a sharp gaze and said, "Asia, I must admit, you are very good at debating. But is your belief based only on logic? Or is there an emotional reason that makes you so sure?" Asia met the professor's gaze with eyes full of confidence. She knew this was a decisive moment. Taking a deep breath, she answered, "Professor, my belief is not just based on logic. I have witnessed God's miracles in my own life. I feel His presence in every breath I take, in every verse I read, and in every prayer I make." Her voice deepened, filled with emotion. "I believe in God not because I was simply taught to believe in Him, but because I have found Him through my own experiences. And I believe that anyone who sincerely searches for the truth will find it too." The room fell into complete silence. Even Professor Eleanor did not respond immediately. Some students looked moved, while others were still processing Asia's words. Finally, the professor gave a small smile. But this time, her smile was different. It was no longer condescending, but rather the smile of someone whose mind had been touched by something profound. However, she was not finished yet. She took a step closer to Asia and said, "All right, Asia. I admit that your answers have been very thought-provoking. But I have one last question." The entire class held their breath. Asia met the professor's gaze, prepared for what could possibly be the most difficult question of this debate. The professor's eyes remained sharp, showing that there was still something troubling her. "Asia," she said in a serious tone, "so far I admit that your arguments have been strong. But there is one thing you haven't answered yet." She paused, letting the anticipation build before finally continuing. "If the God you believe in is truly almighty, then why doesn't He reveal Himself to us? Why is His existence so vague? If He truly exists, why must humans search for Him?" Some students slowly nodded, as if the question had also been lingering in their own minds. It was a question that many skeptics had asked before. Asia did not respond immediately. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if collecting her thoughts. Then, she opened them and looked directly at the professor. "Professor," she said softly, "do you believe that love exists?" Professor Eleanor frowned slightly, surprised by the question. "Of course," she replied firmly. Asia tilted her head slightly. "Then can you show me love physically? Can you take it out of someone's heart, place it on this table, and say, 'Here, this is love'?" Professor Eleanor fell silent. Professor Eleanor began to understand where this conversation was headed. Asia continued, "Love is something real, but we can't see it directly. We only feel it through signs, the way someone treats us, their sacrifices, the warmth we feel when we're with the ones we love." Some students began to nod, realizing the depth of Asia's words. "God is the same way," she continued. "We may not see Him directly, but the signs of His existence are everywhere, in the beauty of nature, the balance of the laws of physics, the ongoing miracle of life. Just as we recognize love through its signs, we recognize God through His creation." Professor Eleanor stared at Asia, her expression difficult to read. She hadn't expected this girl to turn her argument around in such a simple yet powerful way. But she still wouldn't give up. "Asia, I understand your analogy," she said in a calmer tone. "But still, if God truly wanted us to believe in Him, why wouldn't He just reveal Himself? Wouldn't that make things much easier?" Asia smiled slightly. "Professor, if a teacher gives a test to their students, does the teacher provide all the answers before the test begins?" Professor Eleanor fell silent again. Asia continued, "This world is a test, Professor. If God revealed Himself directly, where would the test be? Faith is not about being forced to believe because of undeniable evidence. It's about belief that grows from a heart sincerely seeking the truth." Silence once again filled the room. The students were beginning to understand that this debate was not just an exchange of logical arguments, but something much deeper. Suddenly, a student in the middle row raised his hand. His name was Michael, a physics student known for being skeptical of religion. "Sorry," he said hesitantly, "but I have one question. If God really exists and He is the most just, then why is there so much injustice in this world? Why do good people suffer while bad people live comfortably?" Asa turned to Michael and gave him a gentle smile. She could tell that his question wasn't just about logic, it was personal. "Michael, have you ever seen an artist paint a masterpiece?" she asked. Michael frowned, unsure where this was going. "Yes, of course. When the artist first starts painting, can we immediately understand what he is creating?" Michael shook his head. "No. Sometimes, at first, it just looks like a mess of colors." Asa nodded. "That's exactly how life is. We only see a small part of the grand painting that God is creating. Right now, we may only see suffering and injustice, but we don't see the full picture. Everything in this world has a purpose, even if we don't understand it at the moment." Michael fell silent. He hadn't expected his question to be answered in such a profound way. Professor Eleanor carefully observed the students, watching their expressions as they seemed to be reevaluating their perspectives. She could feel the debate shifting from an intellectual discussion to something much more personal and emotional. But she still had one last argument to make. "Asa," she said, her voice lower but sharper, "you speak so confidently about God and His justice. But what about religion itself? Religion has often been a source of conflict, wars, divisions, even terrorism. Many people claim to act in the name of God. How can you defend something that has brought so much destruction?" The class grew tense. This was a difficult question. Asa took a deep breath. She knew this was the most critical moment. "Professor," she said gently, "is a knife good or bad?" Professor Eleanor frowned. "It depends on how the knife is used." "Exactly," Asa said. "A knife can be used to prepare a beautiful meal, but it can also be used to harm someone. Can we blame the knife for how it is used?" Professor Eleanor remained silent. Asa continued, "The same applies to religion. Religion is a tool. If used correctly, it brings peace, compassion, and justice. But if it falls into the wrong hands, it can be misused for evil. The problem is not religion itself, it's how humans choose to use it." Some students began to clap softly, recognizing the depth of Isa's response. The debate had reached its peak, and many felt that her answer was not only logical but deeply meaningful, but also full of meaning. Professor Eleanor took a deep breath. She looked at Asa with a different expression than before. There was something in her eyes, no longer just a desire to win, but perhaps respect. Yet, she wasn't finished. She exhaled slowly, then said, "Asa, you have given very good answers. But I still have one last question." Asa met the professor's gaze, calm and ready to hear the question that might bring this debate to its peak. Professor Eleanor looked at her deeply and, in a softer voice, asked, "If God really exists, have you ever personally experienced something that proves His existence?" The classroom fell silent again. All eyes were on Asa, waiting for an answer, one that might change everything. Asa took a deep breath. She knew this was the moment to speak from more than just logic. This was the moment to speak from the heart. The students, who had previously been taking notes, were now holding their breath. Even Professor Eleanor, who had seemed so sure of her argument from the beginning, now looked at the girl with a different expression, not as someone trying to win a debate, but as someone who truly wanted to hear the answer. Asa inhaled deeply. "This is no longer about winning an argument," she said softly. "This is about something real." She paused, then continued. "Professor, you asked me if I have ever personally experienced something that proves God's existence. The answer is yes. Not just once, but many times. She looked around at the entire class before continuing. I want to tell you something, an experience that I know is not just a coincidence. The students leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. When I was 10 years old, Asia began. I was in an accident. My mother and I were walking home from school when a truck lost control and came straight toward us. I remember those seconds so clearly, my mother trying to shield me, people screaming, and in my heart, I only had time for one small prayer, "Oh God, please save us." Some students seemed visibly moved, their expressions shifting as they listened. Asia continued, "The truck should have hit us. There was no time to run, no way to escape. But at the last second, something happened. The truck's tires suddenly slipped, and instead of crashing into us, it swerved and slammed into an electric pole nearby. My mother and I were completely unharmed. Even the driver was safe." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Many people called it luck. But I know it wasn't just coincidence. It was an answer to the prayer I whispered in total surrender. Professor Eleanor watched Asia, her eyes unreadable, as if she was processing something beyond just words. But Asia wasn't done. And not only that, she continued, there are many things that we can't explain logically. Asia continued, have you ever felt so desperate, so alone, and then, just at the right time, someone came to help? Have you ever seen someone who had almost lost hope, and suddenly, a solution appeared, one they never expected? Have you ever felt an extraordinary calm while praying, even though your problem hadn't been solved yet? The class remained silent. Many students began to reflect, recalling their own personal experiences. Asia spoke again, her voice softer this time. Professor, God is not always present in a form that we can see with our eyes. But He is always present in a form that we can feel, through the help that arrives just when we need it, through the peace that no science can explain, through the small miracles we often overlook. Professor Eleanor remained silent. Her eyes seemed glassy as if she was holding back an emotion she wasn't ready to show. Then, in a voice quieter than before, she said, Asia, your answer is very compelling. I must admit, I have never heard someone explain faith in this way before. Asia smiled gently. Professor, I am not asking you to believe immediately. Faith is not something that can be forced. But I invite you to think, to see life from a different perspective. Because sometimes, the truth is not just what we understand with our minds, but what we feel with our hearts. The atmosphere in the classroom grew solemn. Some students bowed their heads, moved by the conversation they had just witnessed. Professor Eleanor finally took a deep breath. When she looked at Asia again, her expression had changed. No longer full of challenge, but full of respect. You are an extraordinary young woman, Asia, she said at last. I may still have many questions, but I must admit, your way of thinking has opened a new perspective for me. Asia smiled. Thank you, Professor. Professor Eleanor turned to her students, glancing at them one by one. Then, in a low but firm voice, she said, I want all of you to take something from today's debate. No matter what your beliefs are, the most important thing is to think critically and seek the truth with an open heart. The students nodded in agreement. This was more than just a debate. It was an intellectual journey, one that had opened the minds of many in the room. As the class ended, several students gathered around Asia, eager to continue the discussion. Even Michael, the skeptical student who had asked sharp questions, remained in his seat, lost in thought, contemplating everything he had heard. Meanwhile, Professor Eleanor walked out of the classroom, her steps slow and deliberate. On her face was an expression difficult to decipher, perhaps confusion, perhaps contemplation, or maybe something even deeper. Maybe, for the first time in her life, she was beginning to ask herself, had she spent all these years closing the door to something greater than she could understand? And maybe, just maybe, Somewhere deep within her heart, she had already begun searching for the answer. Moral message: faith is not something that can be forced, it must be found with an open heart. Miracles do not always appear in the way we expect, but they are always present for those who are willing to see them. Seeking truth requires not only logic but also inner sensitivity and personal experience. Differences in belief should not divide us, but instead be opportunities for discussion, learning, and mutual respect. Final reflection. This story is more than just a debate, it is a journey in search of meaning. Sometimes the answers we seek are not found in words, but in experience and deep reflection. If this story inspires you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so we can continue bringing meaningful stories to life. See you in the next story. A Muslim man named Yusuf was wrongfully accused and framed for a crime he did not commit. He was sentenced to prison at Dawah, one of the most notorious prisons in America. Despite being surrounded by adversity, Yusuf remained steadfast in his faith, seeking solace and strength from Allah. His noble character gradually transformed the violent atmosphere in the prison into a place of peace. Many inmates found solace in Islam, and Yusuf became a symbol of light in the midst of darkness. This is the story of Yusuf's journey from prison to paradise, the path of preaching in an American prison. Yusuf was a devout Muslim man, leading a simple life, but one filled with faith and desire to serve Allah. One night, while delivering goods to a warehouse, Yusuf was stopped by the police at a routine checkpoint. He initially felt calm because he had nothing to hide, but the routine check turned into a nightmare when the police found a large package of illegal drugs in his truck. "What is this?" asked one of the officers in a sharp tone. Yusuf was stunned and replied, "I don't know anything about it. I'm just delivering the goods as ordered." His confusion was met with disbelief, and he was immediately arrested. Despite his insistence on innocence, the fabricated evidence was too strong to deny. Even his own employer turned against him, accusing Yusuf of being responsible for the incident. The trial was swift, and Yusuf not only lost his freedom but also the trust of those around him. As he was transported to prison, Yusuf looked out of the vehicle's window, reflecting on his situation. His thoughts were full of despair, but deep inside, he knew that Allah would not forsake him. Prison became a new chapter in his life, a chapter full of tests, but perhaps also filled with wisdom he had yet to understand. On his first day in prison, Yusuf was placed in a high-security facility, surrounded by prisoners with violent criminal backgrounds. The prison was tense, filled with screams and the sound of pounding iron doors. Yusuf was escorted to a small, cold, and dark cell, far from the comfort of the outside world. The room had only an iron bed and an old toilet. Yusuf sat on the bed, trying to process the reality of his new life. "This is your home now," one of the prison officers said sarcastically before locking the cell door. That night, Yusuf had trouble sleeping. Thoughts of the injustice he had suffered kept him awake, but he tried to focus on Allah. He got up, took some water, and prayed in the corner of his cell. With tears in his eyes, he asked Allah for strength. "Oh Allah, I don't know what your plan is, but I'm sure you won't leave me. Give me the strength to survive in this place." The next morning, Yusuf was introduced to the prison routine. He lined up with other inmates to receive food, worked in the prison workshop, and followed strict rules. Yet, he noticed suspicious looks from other prisoners. One man, covered in tattoos, approached Yusuf during lunchtime. "You look too quiet for this place," the man said. Yusuf often felt isolated, as the other prisoners were preoccupied with their own groups. He chose to remain alone, reading the Qur'an in his spare time. His noble character and actions began to draw attention. Despite his isolation, Yusuf's good deeds slowly began to change the atmosphere in the prison. His behavior and morals planted seeds of wisdom that began to grow. Yusuf remained steadfast in his faith, performing the 5 daily prayers in the corner of his cell, even when others mocked him. He also helped fellow inmates with small acts of kindness, such as sharing his food or intervening in fights. One day, while working in the prison workshop, a prisoner named George noticed Yusuf's kindness as he helped another inmate who was struggling. George, an old man who had been in prison for decades, was amazed by Yusuf's sincerity. "Why do you help him?" George asked. Yusuf's answer was simple. "I do it because it is what Allah would want." Yusuf's words made George silent. He wasn't used to hearing such kindness in prison, a place where compassion was rare. But George wasn't the only one who noticed Yusuf. Marcus, the notorious gang leader, began to pay attention to Yusuf's behavior. Marcus was known for his sharp gaze, which made others too afraid to challenge him, but he saw something different in Yusuf. Marcus approached him one day. "You're strange," he said. "Why do you not fear anyone?" Yusuf calmly replied, "I fear only Allah. What can humans do to me if Allah does not allow it?" Marcus nodded slowly. "You are indeed strange, but I like you." Yusuf's words had left a lasting impression on Marcus, and soon after, Yusuf's reputation for honesty and courage began to spread. A small incident in the prison only helped his cause. One of the younger inmates became ill, but no one, not even the prison officers, cared to help. Yusuf was the only one who stepped in, helping the sick inmate despite the indifference around him. Yusuf's noble character continued to win the hearts of the prisoners, and slowly, the prison began to change. Through his unwavering faith and dedication to helping others, Yusuf became a beacon of hope in a place filled with darkness. His journey, from a prisoner wrongly convicted, to a man who found peace in Allah, and ultimately to a symbol of light and guidance in the prison, showed that even in the most difficult circumstances, there is always a way to find hope and purpose. They began to approach him, not to seek conflict, but to seek answers. In the dark prison, Yusuf became like a small light that started to illuminate the darkness. However, Yusuf's journey was far from over. He knew the real test had just begun. Yusuf's calmness and good morals slowly attracted the attention of more prisoners, including someone unexpected, Marcus, the leader of the most feared and notorious gang in the prison. Marcus, though known for his brutality and mercilessness, carried an inner wound from a past full of violence and betrayal, which had shaped him into someone who always chose violence as his escape. Every day, Marcus went through his routine. One day, while observing Yusuf, he was struck by a question. "How can you be so calm in a place like this? Everyone here is broken, yet you look so peaceful." Yusuf's response was simple but profound. "It is because I have Allah. With Him, I find comfort. He is my strength, and He alone holds my heart. I can forgive and keep my peace because I trust in Him." Marcus felt an unsettling restlessness after hearing those words. He left without saying anything, but Yusuf's words planted a seed in his heart. For the first time, Marcus began to question whether there was a way for him to find peace. He had always felt that he was too far gone to ever find redemption. Too broken to be fixed. But Yusuf's words were like a glimmer of hope in the face of his despair. Was there hope for someone like him? The conversation sparked a change in Marcus. For the first time, he began to pay attention to Yusuf, though he was still haunted by his past. His gang members noticed his transformation, and some began to suspect that Marcus was not the same man he used to be. Yet Yusuf continued to guide him with patience, teaching him that change was a process, one that required time and sincerity. Marcus started to feel a peace he had never known before, but he was aware that his change did not go unnoticed by his gang. They were watching him closely, especially as he distanced himself from their way of life. Still, Marcus was determined. He continued to reflect on Yusuf's words about Allah's forgiveness and the peace that only he could provide. Meanwhile, Yusuf continued to go about his daily routine. He never forced anyone to accept Islam. He simply lived by the principles of good character and moral integrity, letting his actions speak for themselves. One morning, While sitting in the small prison garden reading the Qur'an, a man known as the Master Robber approached him. With a dark past and a hardened heart, the man asked, "What's in that book?" Yusuf smiled and closed his small Qur'an. "This is Allah's guidance for life. It teaches us who we are, why we were created, and where we are going." The man frowned. "Why were we created? I feel like I've failed as a human being. My life is a mess." Yusuf replied, "Allah created us to worship Him and to be His caliphs on this earth. No matter how far we've strayed, as long as we turn to Him, He will accept us. That's His promise." The man's expression softened. "Do you really believe that? That He will accept someone like me, no matter how many wrongs I've done?" Yusuf nodded. "Allah always accepts His servants who repent, no matter how big their sins. What's important is that we turn to Him with a sincere heart." Other prisoners began to gather around, drawn by Yusuf's words. They were not only curious about the teachings of Islam but also about the peace they saw in his life. The prison cells, once filled with noise and conflict, now resonated with the quiet peace of Yusuf's faith. During work hours and in the yard, more and more prisoners began to gather to listen to Yusuf share the teachings of Islam. He spoke slowly, patiently explaining the core values of Islam, emphasizing that Allah's mercy and forgiveness were available to all who sought it with sincerity. As they listened, the prisoners began to feel a shift within themselves. Some, who were previously quick to complain or act out in anger, now showed a calmer, more peaceful demeanor. Marcus, who had been standing a little distance away, overheard Yusuf's words. His heart was pierced by the reminder of his sinful past, and for the first time, he truly believed that there might be hope for him, that change was possible. As the days passed, more and more prisoners came to learn from Yusuf. They not only began to understand Islam but also experienced a profound change in their own hearts. The once chaotic and violent atmosphere of the prison was beginning to change, thanks to one man's unwavering faith and commitment to guiding others towards peace. The prison, which had been full of violence, slowly began to change into a more peaceful place. However, this change was not welcomed by everyone. There was another group of prisoners, especially those who had joined the big gangs, who felt threatened by Yusuf's influence. For them, this change could disrupt their power in the prison. Marcus, who had initially taken the path of destruction, began to understand that the path he had taken only led to chaos, not peace. His transformation became a big test for both him and Yusuf. But Yusuf was certain that Allah would guide the heart of anyone who sincerely wanted to change. The light of Islam began to shine in the prison, and Yusuf's journey of preaching had just begun. As the prison slowly transformed, the big gangs, who had once controlled the dynamics, saw the change in some of their members' attitudes as a threat to their power. Yusuf, who was once seen as harmless, was now becoming a serious threat to their authority. One evening, in one of the dark corners of the prison, several gang leaders gathered to discuss how to deal with Yusuf's growing influence. "He's making our people weak," said a big man with a scar on his face. "If this continues, no one will be afraid of us anymore." Another gang leader added, "He's just an ordinary man." But despite their dismissals, Marcus knew there was something about Yusuf that made people believe in him. The next day, Marcus met Yusuf on the prison sports field. This time, Marcus didn't have his usual stern expression. "We have a problem," Marcus said bluntly. Yusuf closed his Quran and looked at Marcus calmly. "What's happening?" he asked. "People don't like the changes you've brought." "You're threatening my position," Marcus replied. But Yusuf remained calm. "Life is in God's hands," he said. "In God's hands I will find something to do." Yusuf's words left Marcus speechless. He had never met anyone so sure of their destiny. Behind his silence, Marcus became more and more hesitant, wanting to protect Yusuf but knowing that his position as gang leader made it difficult to openly take a side. That night, tensions in the prison rose. The gang warned Marcus that Yusuf might become more of a problem. "Be more careful," one gang member warned. "I can't always protect you." After that incident, Marcus couldn't sleep. Yusuf's words kept ringing in his head. "Allah protects me," he thought. The next day, Marcus returned to meet Yusuf again, this time without the pressure of his gang or suspicion from others. They sat in the small prison garden where Yusuf often read the Qur'an. "I never believed in God before," Marcus began, his tone softer than usual. "My life was too hard to believe there was someone who cared about me." Yusuf looked at Marcus with concern. "What made you think that?" Yusuf asked. Marcus sighed, his gaze distant. "I lost my father when I was little. My mother left us. I lived on the streets, full of violence. I was taught that if I didn't attack first, I'd be punished," Marcus explained. "Why did she let me become a monster?" he wondered. Marcus had never thought about sin or the hope of forgiveness. But now, for the first time, he began to realize that even his sins, as big as mountains, could be forgiven. Marcus felt a tear forming, but he quickly wiped it away. Over the next few days, Marcus's changes became more visible. He no longer showed a rude attitude toward others and began to approach Yusuf with curiosity. The decision to change was not easy, but it was the right one. Even though the path was full of obstacles, Marcus began to find the light in his heart. His transformation became the center of attention in the prison. The man who was once feared for his violence was now showing a different side. Marcus spent more time with Yusuf, listening to Islamic teachings, and began to practice the values he had learned. News of Marcus's change spread quickly. People who had once been afraid of him now began to approach him with curiosity, wanting to know what had made Marcus, the leader of a brutal gang, change into someone more peaceful. Slowly, the atmosphere in the prison began to change. The quarrels that used to happen often began to decrease. Several prisoners who had been involved in large gangs began to leave their groups and approach Yusuf. They felt a sense of calm that they had never felt before. Even the prison officers noticed this change. One morning, a senior officer named Mr. Robert approached Yusuf. "I don't know what you did, but this prison feels calmer," Mr. Robert said. "What exactly happened?" But this change also brought new challenges. The gangs who still maintained their power began to feel threatened by Yusuf and Marcus. They saw them as a threat to their control over the prison. Some prisoners began to plan how to stop the growing influence of Marcus, who had now become Yusuf's protector. Aware of the threat, Yusuf was approached one night with a serious warning. "Yusuf, there are some who don't like what's happening," one of the prisoners said in a grave tone. The prison, once filled with violence, was now slowly transforming into a more peaceful place. Yusuf and Marcus had become symbols of hope for many, but Yusuf knew the road ahead would not be easy. Those who resisted this change were beginning to pose a new challenge, and while the light of Islam was now illuminating the prison, maintaining that peace would be their greatest test. The peace in the prison was fragile. As more and more prisoners turned to Yusuf and Islam, the factions that felt threatened began to retaliate. The largest gang in the prison, once led by Marcus, started plotting how to stop the influence of Yusuf and the growing number of converts. "You need to put a stop to him," one of the gang leaders said. "He talks too much, and if this continues, he'll weaken us." Marcus immediately confronted the leader. "Are you serious? You're willing to destroy what's been built?" The gang leader responded. "We have to stop him. He's changing everything here." In response, Marcus warned them. "Get ready. Tomorrow, we confront this head-on." The next day, Yusuf and Marcus found themselves caught in the middle of a dangerous confrontation. As they walked through a narrow hallway, a gang leader and his men blocked their path, brandishing sharp weapons they had hidden. They intended to attack Yusuf, but before they could strike, Marcus appeared out of nowhere and stood between Yusuf and the attackers. "If you want to hurt him," Marcus said boldly, You have to kill me first." The gang members were taken aback by Marcus' courage. "Marcus, have you forgotten who we are?" one of them demanded. Marcus calmly replied, "I remember, but I also remember that life is more than just violence. I'm here to protect Yusuf, not because of respect, but because I believe in what he's teaching." The incident became the talk of the prison. Many began to see Yusuf and Marcus not as threats, but as symbols of change. Even some of the most notorious gang members started to question their paths, as the influence of Yusuf's teachings continued to spread. But Yusuf knew that this was the final test for him in prison. Allah had shown him that even in the darkest places, the light of truth could shine. One morning, Yusuf was called to the warden's office. He walked there calmly, unsure of what awaited him. Mr. Robert, the head of security, greeted him with a small smile. "I have good news for you," he said. "New evidence has emerged in your case, and the court has decided to release you." The news spread quickly through the prison. Many prisoners, now wearing white caps as a symbol of their faith, gathered in the yard. Marcus stood at the front with other converts, including those who had followed Yusuf's teachings. "You may be leaving, Yusuf," Marcus said, his voice trembling, "but your teachings will remain with us." Yusuf placed a hand on Marcus' shoulder and smiled. "I never did this alone. It was Allah who guided me. I only showed you the way." As Yusuf walked out of the prison gates, the weight of years of confinement lifted. He felt free for the first time in years, but more importantly, he felt close to Allah. He realized that his time in prison was not a punishment but a spiritual journey, one that had led him to his purpose, leading by example, not by force. Yusuf continued his journey of spreading the message of Islam. Years later, he became a well-known Islamic preacher, sharing his story with others. He spoke of how the light of Islam had changed not only his life but also the lives of those around him, including Marcus. The prison, once a place of fear and violence, had transformed into a place of peace, all thanks to the power of faith. Yusuf's journey may have ended behind the prison walls, but the seeds he planted continued to bear fruit, bringing blessings and change to many. This was not just Yusuf's story, it was the miracle of Allah's guidance, which can change anyone's heart, no matter where they are. Today, we delve into an extraordinary story, an event that shook the intellectual and spiritual world. Imagine an atheist professor, a brilliant scientist who had spent decades believing that God was nothing more than a myth, suddenly left speechless by a 5-year-old child. This is not just an ordinary debate, it is a clash between high-level logic and pure sincerity. A young Muslim boy, who has never even attended school, finds himself at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, challenging a renowned intellectual. Dr. Nicholas Stevens is no ordinary professor. He is a highly respected philosopher and scientist who has dedicated his life to proving that religion is merely a collection of ancient myths without any scientific foundation. Over the years, he has engaged in debates with numerous scholars, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, and Buddhists, and has always emerged victorious. On the other hand, there is a young boy named Einstein Carter. He is just 5 years old and comes from a simple yet devout Muslim family in London. Despite his young age, Einstein possesses remarkable intelligence and a profound understanding of Islam. He frequently asks his father deep questions about God, the universe, and the purpose of life, questions that sometimes leave even adults speechless. The story begins when Dr. Nicholas attends a major conference on science and religion at one of England's leading universities. Standing confidently before a vast audience, he declares, "God is nothing more than a human illusion." He presents a series of scientific arguments, citing the theory of evolution, the laws of physics, and modern philosophical concepts. "If God truly exists," he continues, "why can't we see him? Why has science never found any evidence of his existence?" For a moment, the room falls silent. Then, applause and cheers erupt from his supporters. But amidst the crowd, a small child raises his hand. Einstein, sitting on his father's lap, innocently asks, "Professor, may I ask something?" All eyes turn to him. A little boy wants to challenge an atheist professor. The atmosphere shifts, some chuckle, assuming this will be an amusing moment. But Dr. Nicholas, with a hint of sarcasm, nods and says, "Of course, little one. What would you like to ask?" Einstein takes a deep breath, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. In a gentle voice, he asks, "Professor, do you have a mind?" Dr. Nicholas frowns slightly before chuckling. "Of course I have a mind," he replies. Einstein nods. "But I can't see it. I can't touch it or hear it. Does that mean your mind doesn't exist?" The room falls into complete silence. Some people whisper among themselves, while others watch intently. Dr. Nicholas, usually quick-witted with his responses, suddenly seems unsettled. Hundreds of eyes remain fixed on him. The atheist professor who has never lost a debate, now faced with a question he never expected from a 5-year-old child. For a few seconds, the room remains hushed. Dr. Nicholas stares at Einstein, who sits calmly on his father's lap, a serene smile on his face. The boy shows no fear, no hesitation, despite having just challenged one of the greatest intellectuals of his time. Murmurs ripple through the audience. Some dismiss the moment as mere coincidence, while others begin to wonder, could a child truly leave a professor at a loss for words? Dr. Nicholas takes a deep breath, composing himself. With a slight smile, he responds, "Reason is not something we can see with our eyes, but we can perceive it through thought and logic." Einstein nods quickly, as if anticipating this answer. "Exactly," he says confidently. "Just like God. We may not be able to see Him, but we can feel His presence through His creation, through logic, and through our hearts." Once again, silence blankets the room. This time, there is no laughter, no whispers, only deep contemplation as the audience processes the profound words of a 5-year-old boy. Dr. Nicholas narrows his eyes, his expression unreadable. Finally, he asks, "All right then, explain this to me. If God truly exists, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why are there wars, hunger, and disease? If God is all-loving, why does He allow such things to happen?" Now, it is Einstein's turn to fall silent, not out of uncertainty, but because he is carefully formulating his response. Einstein did not remain silent because he lacked an answer, but because he wanted to choose his words carefully. The entire audience waited with bated breath. After a moment, Einstein finally spoke. "Professor, have you ever seen a mother take her child to the doctor for an injection?" Dr. Nicholas frowned but nodded. "Of course." "Did the child cry?" "Yes, usually they do," Nicholas admitted. "Was the mother evil for letting her child get an injection and feel pain?" Nicholas fell silent again. He could already see where this conversation was going. Einstein continued, "Sometimes, something that looks bad to us is actually something good in the long run. God allows trials and suffering not because He doesn't care, but because there is a greater wisdom that we may not understand yet." The room fell silent again. Some of the audience members nodded slowly in agreement, while others still looked stunned. Nicholas took a deep breath. This was not the answer he had expected from a child. Normally, he could easily refute this kind of argument when debating with adults. But this time, something was different. Einstein's words did not sound like memorized dogma or rehearsed teachings. They felt like they came from genuine understanding, an understanding that even many adults failed to grasp. However, Nicholas was not ready to give up. He still had more questions. "Well," he said finally, "if God exists and He created everything, then who created God?" Several people in the audience nodded in agreement with this classic question, often used in debates about the existence of God. Einstein smiled. "Professor, do you know about the number 0? Nicholas frowned. "Of course. Zero is a number in the number system that represents nothingness. Who created zero? Ainsley asked. Nicholas was silent for a moment. Zero doesn't need to be created. It's a fundamental concept in mathematics. Ainsley nodded quickly. And so is God. He wasn't created because he is the beginning of everything. He is the creator, not the one who was created. Nicholas suddenly felt his head spinning. He had heard this argument many times before, but for some reason, this time it felt different. Maybe it was the way the boy delivered it. Maybe it was the simplicity of the logic he used. But as a scientist, Nicholas could not allow himself to accept defeat so easily. But what about scientific evidence? He pressed. Science has never found concrete proof of God's existence. Ainsley smiled again. Professor, have you ever seen the wind? Nicholas sighed. We can't see the wind, but we can feel it. Exactly, Ainsley said. Just like the wind, we may not be able to see God, but we can feel His presence through His creation, just as we feel the wind when it blows. We can see the signs of God in the universe. Nicholas opened his mouth to refute, but then fell silent. The boy's words continued to linger in his mind. At that moment, suddenly, someone in the audience clapped. Then another person. And another. Until finally, the whole room was filled with applause. Nicholas felt something heavy in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was anger, frustration, or something else. But one thing was clear: for the first time in his life, he felt doubt creeping into his beliefs. The applause gradually faded, but its effect remained. Dr. Nicholas Stevens sat still on the stage, his eyes fixed on Ainsley, the 5-year-old boy who had just cornered him in a debate he should have won easily. All his life, Nicholas had faced great thinkers, theologians, scientists, and philosophers from various backgrounds, but none of them had ever made him feel like this. Not because the boy had presented an argument too complex to counter, but because something about his words resonated deeply. Nicholas tried to calm his mind. This is just a coincidence, he told himself. Just a clever play on words from a child who happens to be smart. But then why did he feel like he couldn't just ignore this feeling? Meanwhile, Ainsley remained seated on his father's lap, his face carrying an innocent expression, as if he had no idea what he had just done. The weight of the boy's words was undeniable. How could a 5-year-old possess such sharp, profound thoughts? Shouldn't a child his age be naive, unburdened by such deep contemplation? But here he was, challenging an esteemed professor with unwavering confidence. Dr. Nicholas Stevens exhaled slowly, gripping the microphone once more. He couldn't afford to back down so easily. All right, he said, his voice calmer now, though still laced with skepticism. I admit your argument is quite thought-provoking. But there's still something that bothers me. If God truly exists, why are there so many religions in the world? Why do people believe in different gods? If God is one, why are humans so divided in their beliefs? Ainsley looked at him, then briefly turned to his father, as if seeking permission to respond. His father simply smiled and nodded, allowing his son to answer in his own way. Professor, Ainsley began, his voice steady. Have you ever heard the story of the blind man and the elephant? Nicholas furrowed his brow. Blind men? What do you mean? Ainsley continued unfazed. Imagine a group of blind men encountering an elephant for the first time. Each of them touches a different part of the animal and describes what they feel. The first man grabs the trunk and says the elephant is like a snake. The second man touches its leg and disagrees, no, the elephant is like a tree. The third man feels its ear and says, you're both wrong. The elephant is like a fan. The fourth man presses his palm against its body and argues, no, the elephant is like a wall. And the fifth man, holding its tail, scoffs at them all, you're all mistaken. The elephant is like a rope. The room fell silent. Even those who had previously sided with Nicholas leaned in, captivated by the young boy's words. Ainsley went on, his tone calm yet firm. Each of them had touched a different part of the same elephant, yet they argued because none of them could see the whole picture. It is the same with people and religion. Many have found parts of the truth, but they do not see the complete reality. That is why there are so many different beliefs in the world. But the ultimate truth, he paused, his gaze unwavering, is one. And that truth is found in the perfect guidance of God. Nicholas rubbed his forehead. He had to admit, the analogy was brilliant. But he wasn't ready to concede just yet. He straightened and, with a heavier voice, asked, "Then tell me, why Islam? What makes you so sure that your religion is the absolute truth?" Ainsley met his gaze, eyes clear and full of conviction. "Because Islam is the only religion that explains God logically and perfectly. It does not claim that God is a human being or that he has any need or weakness. Islam teaches that God is one, eternal, self-sufficient, and beyond human limitations. He does not beget, nor is he begotten. And more than that," Ainsley continued, his voice unwavering, "Islam is the only religion whose holy book has remained unchanged since it was first revealed." Nicholas felt his chest tighten. He had studied many religions, including Islam. He knew the Qur'an was unique. No revisions, no alternate versions, over 1,400 years, and it remained exactly as it was revealed. Unlike other religious texts, which had undergone countless alterations, the Qur'an stood untouched. He clenched his jaw, pushing the thought aside. He couldn't let himself falter. But before he could argue, Ainsley spoke again, his voice softer but no less resolute. "Professor, do you believe this universe came into existence by chance?" Nicholas nodded almost instinctively. "Yes. Everything exists due to the laws of nature, evolution, gravity, physics. There is no need to introduce the concept of God to explain the workings of the universe." Ainsley sighed slightly, then posed a simple question. Imagine a man walking into a dense forest. There, he finds a magnificent house, complete with a beautifully maintained garden, warm lights glowing from within, and fresh food laid out on the table. Would it make sense for him to believe that this house appeared by pure chance, formed by the wind, the trees, and the elements, without anyone having built it? Nicholas stiffened. He knew where this was going. Ainsley pressed on. "This universe is far more complex than a house. The precise balance of life, the laws of physics, the perfect alignment of planetary orbits, the intricacy of human DNA, everything is meticulously arranged. Can we truly believe that all of this came into existence by accident, without any creator?" Nicholas bit his lip. He wanted to counter, to argue, but something inside him hesitated. He felt an unfamiliar discomfort creeping in, not because he had lost the debate, not because a 5-year-old had outwitted him, but because, for the first time in his life, he was beginning to doubt his own beliefs. All his life, he had prided himself on being a rational scientist. He had dismissed the idea of God as mere superstition, believing that life was nothing more than a cosmic accident. But now, standing before this child, he felt an unsettling possibility creeping into his mind. What if he had been wrong all along? Just then, a small cough from behind the stage broke the tension. The moderator, who had allowed the debate to unfold, finally spoke. "All right, I think we've let this discussion go on for quite some time. We should give others in the audience a chance to ask questions." Some spectators looked disappointed, as if they had hoped to hear more. But Nicholas felt an odd sense of relief. He needed time to process everything, time to understand what had just happened. Taking a deep breath, he turned back to Ainsley. "You are an extraordinary child," he admitted quietly. Ainsley simply smiled. "Thank you, Professor. I only answered with logic, just as you taught us to." Nicholas let out a soft chuckle, though it sounded more like the laugh of a man grappling with confusion. His mind was overflowing. He wanted to escape, to brush it all aside. But deep down, he knew the questions Ainsley had posed wouldn't simply disappear. And maybe, just maybe, for the first time in his life, he needed to seek out the answers. That night, Dr. Nicholas Stevens sat alone on the balcony of his hotel room, gazing down at the city below. The lights stretched endlessly, twinkling like stars scattered across the earth. But no matter how bright they shone, they couldn't illuminate the questions that now haunted his mind. But his mind refused to calm down. He took a sip of his coffee, hoping the bitterness would distract him, but it did nothing to quiet the storm of thoughts swirling inside him. The little boy, Ainsley Carter. How could a 5-year-old speak with such depth and clarity? Nicholas had spent most of his life studying philosophy, science, and religion. He had encountered countless debates and had always found ways to refute theological arguments with logic. But this time was different. Ainsley's words weren't just arguments. They felt like keys unlocking a door inside him, a door he had kept tightly shut for years. He tried to shake off his unease by revisiting the notes he had taken during the debate. Does it make sense that a perfect house could form by itself, without anyone designing it? He stared at the sentence for a long time. It was such a simple analogy, yet frustratingly difficult to refute. He had spent years teaching about evolution, the Big Bang, and the intricate processes that shaped life. He understood how single cells evolved into complex organisms. But he also knew that the universe operated under precise, unchanging laws. Nicholas shook his head. "This is nonsense," he muttered. But the more he tried to dismiss it, the more the questions took root in his mind. If the universe is just a product of chance, why is it so perfectly ordered? If life has no purpose, why do humans constantly search for meaning? He got up from his chair and paced across the balcony. He had always prided himself on being rational and logical, never allowing emotions to dictate his beliefs. But now, something deep inside him stirred, something he couldn't ignore. Could I have been wrong? The question hit him harder than he expected. His mind drifted back to his childhood. He had grown up in a family that valued reason over faith. His father, a scientist, had always dismissed the idea of God, calling it a human-made illusion. His mother, a historian, believed that religions were just cultural constructs. Nicholas remembered asking his father once, "Who created us?" His father had simply chuckled. "No one created us, son. The universe is just a coincidence." And from that moment on, Nicholas had accepted it as truth. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had overlooked something crucial. He opened his laptop and began searching. He read articles about Islam, watched debates between Muslim scholars and atheists, and even looked up passages from the Qur'an. The more he read, the more he found himself intrigued. One verse, in particular, stood out. Were they created by nothing, or did they create themselves? Quran 52:35. He read the verse again. And again. It was a question he had never seriously considered. How could something come from nothing? How could life create itself? And if humans did not create themselves, then who did? He searched for counterarguments, hoping to dismiss the verse as just another religious claim. But nothing he found truly satisfied him. Still restless, Nicholas thought of someone, an old friend, David Wren. David was also a scientist, but unlike Nicholas, he was a Muslim. Over the years, they had debated religion countless times, but Nicholas had always dismissed David's faith as something he held on to due to tradition. Now, for the first time, Nicholas felt the need to hear him out. He opened a video call. After a few rings, David's face appeared on the screen. "Nicholas?" David raised an eyebrow. "This is a surprise. Haven't heard from you in a while." Nicholas gave a small, tired smile. "Yeah, I know. Sorry for the sudden call. I wanted to ask you something." David leaned forward, intrigued. "Go on." Nicholas hesitated before speaking. Islam. A brief look of surprise crossed David's face, but he remained calm. What about it? Nicholas took a deep breath. I had a debate today with a 5-year-old kid, and somehow he made me question everything. David chuckled. A 5-year-old? Sounds like you met someone special. Nicholas nodded. He spoke about God in a way that actually made sense. And now, I can't stop thinking about it. David studied him for a moment before saying, Nicholas, for years I tried to explain Islam to you, but you always brushed it off. What's changed? Nicholas sighed. I don't know. Maybe, for the first time in my life, I don't have all the answers. David smiled. Then maybe it's time you start looking for them. After the call, Nicholas stepped onto the balcony again, looking up at the endless night sky. Science had given him knowledge of how the universe worked. But now, Islam was offering him an answer to why it existed. Science explained the mechanics of life. But Islam explained its purpose. For the first time in his life, Nicholas felt like he was standing at a crossroads. Should he continue clinging to his old beliefs, refusing to question them? Or should he allow himself to explore the possibility that he had been wrong all along? The stars shimmered above him, distant and silent witnesses to his inner turmoil. He took a deep breath. There was no more running from this. He had to find the truth. And in the morning, he would take the first step. Nicholas reached out to his old friend, David Rosenberg, a Muslim, and asked to meet. When they finally sat across from each other, David greeted him warmly. I didn't think you would actually come, David said with a smile. Nicholas sighed. I didn't expect it either. But I need answers, David. I can't ignore this anymore. They sat in a small cafe, and after a brief silence, Nicholas asked the question that had been weighing on his mind. What makes you so sure that Islam is the truth? David smiled and responded calmly. Nicholas, you're a scientist. You always look for evidence and logic in everything. But have you ever asked yourself, why is the universe so orderly? Why are there precise laws governing everything? Nicholas nodded. I've thought about that. David continued. The Qur'an speaks about the creation of the universe, the stages of fetal development, and many other scientific facts that were only discovered centuries later. How could someone in the 7th century have known all this without divine revelation? Nicholas remained silent. He had read a few verses from the Qur'an before, and he had to admit, some of them were astonishing. But what about God? Nicholas finally asked. I can't just believe in something I can't see. David smiled. You can't see gravity, but you believe in it because you see its effects. Likewise, we see the order of the universe, the balance in life, and the wonders around us. They are all signs of his existence. Nicholas stared at David for a long time. The words made sense. David then invited him to meet with a scholar at a nearby mosque. At first, Nicholas felt awkward. He had never stepped into a place of worship before. But there was something about the atmosphere that made him want to stay. An elderly scholar with a kind smile welcomed him. What brings you here, Mr. Stevens? He asked gently. Nicholas took a deep breath. I'm searching for the truth. The scholar nodded knowingly. The truth is always there for those who sincerely seek it. Nicholas began asking the questions that had been troubling him, about the existence of God, the concept of God in Islam, and the relationship between science and religion. The scholar answered each question with clarity, logic, and strong reasoning. God does not ask us to believe without thinking, the scholar explained. Even in the Qur'an, Allah repeatedly invites humanity to reflect, to ponder, and to seek the truth. The more Nicholas listened, the more convinced he became. No one was forcing him to believe. He was being guided to find the answers himself. That night, back in his hotel room, Nicholas sat in front of the mirror and looked at himself. He was no longer the same man he had been weeks ago. He had always believed that life was nothing more than a coincidence. But now, he sensed something greater, something he had ignored for too long. He picked up the Qur'an that David had given him and opened it at random. His eyes fell upon a verse. Whoever Allah wills to guide, He opens his heart to Islam. Quran 6:125. A feeling of peace washed over him, something he had never experienced before. He knew the time had come. With a steady heart, he called David and asked him to accompany him to the mosque the next day. Standing before the scholar and a few witnesses, Nicholas recited the Shahada. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. As soon as the words left his lips, tears streamed down his face. He had always relied on logic and rationality, but for the first time in his life, he had found something beyond logic. He had found the truth. Dr. Nicholas Stevens' journey is proof that truth is always available to those who sincerely seek it. Islam does not demand blind faith. It invites people to think, to question, and to understand. Sometimes, the most profound realizations come from the most unexpected places, even from the words of a 5-year-old child. Everyone has their own spiritual journey, but the most important thing is the courage to ask and the humility to accept the answers. It is never too late to find the light, for guidance can come at any time, from any place. Never stop searching. Never be afraid to ask. And always keep your heart open to the answers you might have been avoiding all along.